And with that, we will begin. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wa salam ala rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wa ahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli rabbi zidni ilma. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and send peace and blessings upon our final messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. Welcome to Silruz, the Center for Islamic Life at Rutgers University's Taboo Topics. And this time I'm going to be speaking about purifying the gaze. The Taboo Topics series is a event series that we started or we initiated, I don't know, I think 3 years ago now, alhamdulillah. And the whole point of this series is that we engage with a topic that oftentimes the Muslim community hard time speaking about in public settings. And really where this event series originated was, alhamdulillah, we have an opportunity to serve as a chaplaincy on our campus. And as a chaplaincy, we get exposed to certain issues and get insight into certain phenomenon that exist within the Muslim community and are affecting people at a very personal level, but for whatever reason, whether it be a stigma against it, whether us not having a complex enough language to describe it, it doesn't get brought up in more public settings. And the point of Taboo Topics is to bring up that topic or some of the insights we've learned about it in a more public setting so that inshallah it opens the doors for those of us that were too shy to really address this issue, for communities to address this issue that maybe should have been doing it earlier, to finally get that chance to engage. And Taboo Topics has always been a introduction to a topic and not a effort to completely summarize the topic in any way, shape, or form. So again, this opens the dialogue for this so that it can continue moving forward, inshallah. And with that, the topic that was chosen this week was purifying the gaze. The idea of our gaze being a very real and very impactful part of ourselves, and what impact controlling it and what impact on the opposite end, not controlling it, has on people's lives. And then some techniques around navigating through some of the major pitfalls of the gaze or of the sight that unfortunately exist within our society today, such as pornography. So that's inshallah going to be the topic. We've used a multiple style approach in terms of how we've addressed or put together taboo topics. Certain times it's me talking with a clinician of some sort where there's a presentation. Other times it's a direct interview where I will be asking questions of expert in some way. Today, what we wanted to do actually was have a casual conversation between me and Patty. Chaplain Patty has been a friend of mine for, I don't know, 5 years now, maybe a little bit longer. And this is a topic that on and off throughout the years we've heard of, and we've discussed kind of techniques of how to address it once it comes up within our communities. So inshallah, today is going to be a casual conversation on the idea of purifying the gaze, the idea of what do maybe we as a community need to hear about this in order to address it and take away the taboo that's associated with it, inshallah. So with that introduction, Chaplain Patty, I will give you a brief intro. She has been the Muslim chaplain now for how many years now?
My 5th year, yeah.
MashaAllah. So
we started the same time, actually, the same semester.
That's true. You were my sister chaplain, literally, at Penn 5 years ago, and so she's been practicing there and has a number of qualifications to speak about not just this issue, but any issue to young Muslims developing in their tarbiyah, with studies both abroad and within the United States. So with that, I'm just going to actually first toss it over to Chaplain Patty. Let's get into it.
Thank you so much, Imam Kaiser, for inviting me to have this conversation with you and for hosting this forum. I think it's so important, and I'm so grateful that your students have you there at Rutgers. I know Imam Kaiser really. I know what a resource he is. We've been in many forums together, and you as a community are blessed to have him, and I'm blessed to have him in such proximity as well. And I'm really grateful whenever we're able to, connect and have these conversations and other conversations. But I really, again, I'm very grateful that you're having these taboo topics, right? Because, when we think about, the brotherhood and sisterhood, right? This idea of trying to be protectors for one another, right? We have to deal with the things that people are dealing with, right? When we talk about the strength of the Jama, right? If we have these, if people are carrying around things that they're not discussing, right? Then they feel this alienation from the Jama, and we're not quite, taking care of that community aspect. We're not quite there how we need to be in terms of brothers and sisters, right? And so, I think it's important to have these forums that we can talk about things in a way that people can take back, and then they can go and get resources. And also, sometimes it's the students themselves will have a conversation. Maybe someone is too shy to talk to you or to talk to me, but they talk to one another, right? And so, those of you that are here, hopefully we can have this conversation. You can think about it, and then when you find things that are related to this topic, inshallah, you will be better equipped to, support your peers, your friends, and then also kind of direct them back to resources. As we're starting this kind of conversation, I realized, I was saying with Imam Kaiser, like the week that we're in, and knowing that a lot of people have been sitting with a lot of anxiety, waiting to see what is the outcome of this election. And I actually finally sat down last night and I watched the Netflix thing, The Social Dilemma. I don't know if you watched that yet, but that the entire documentary is actually partly a commentary on lowering your gaze, in a sense, right? So I recommend that you watch it, right? And I'm thinking about things in terms of, we have this idea of lowering our gaze in our spiritual tradition that has always been there, right? It's in the old books. It's part of human nature that, what we look at, it affects our hearts, right? And I've been thinking about 20 years ago, reading, an article by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, right? Where it talked about the breakdown of some parts of civil society that was caused by the TV, right? So that because, those generations and decades that had TVs in the house, people were less social. It had broke down social relationships, right? Because they were spending more time in front of the TV. And I remember a story about, uh, this, I guess, researcher who had visited a remote village. I believe it was in India. And he found the people essentially on their fitra, right? So we in this human nature, and they smiled all the time, and they were so happy, and they had a simple life, and they were very poor. And he went to them and asked them about their life, and they were just told them how blessed that they were, right? And how they had everything. He went back 10 years later. He interviewed the same person and had the same host. And he said, and all he talked about was how poor they were and how they didn't have anything and all of these different things. The only thing that had changed in that 10 years was that they had gotten a TV in the village. And so it created this sense of, they call it relative deprivation, right? So this sense of, because you're looking at these images of other people, now you're somehow not content, right? And I'm giving this long story because, how does lowering our gaze connect with even the moment that we're in politically, right? When, our gaze is basically what's for sale, right? That there are these forces that are trying to basically profit off our gaze to our detriment, right? And with, callous disregard of the harm that's there. And so that's kind of coming up. And I just wanted to bring that up because, we're going to get into a specific aspect of it, because normally when we think of lowering the gaze, we think of men and women, right? But it's not just that, right? It's also the lowering the gaze in terms of, possessions, and in terms of all of these other things as well. And how that affects like kind of the kind of the contentment of the heart, right? And this, the holding of the gaze, right? Whether you're talking about the political thing or if you're talking about trying to make money off of people, it's what is going to hold your gaze, and it's the thing that is shocking to you, or the thing that's going to keep your gaze the most. And nothing is more natural to keep the gaze, of a human being than actually a potential mate.
Yeah, subhanallah. I think there was so much wisdom and so many gems you just spoke about in regards to the gaze, what holds our attention, because this will be the statement of Ibn Qayyim al-Jawzi. He says it first about the tongue, and it's a part of a much longer statement, but he says first about the tongue that what comes out of the tongue is like a spoon to what is the dish, and it's much better in Arabic, but it's this idea of like gives you a taste. And then what he says even further, he goes, and what is consumed by the eyes is what is the ingredients of what exists within the soul.
Mm.
And I think that what holds your attention has a lot to do with what forms you. Is a much bigger concept within our tradition. And subhanAllah, I think it's very interesting. And I always like sometimes redefining terms. And when I mean redefining terms, I don't necessarily mean by coming up with a new definition, but more of the terms we use on a day-to-day basis, making sure we appreciate them for the depth that they have within it. And when we talk about specifically the gaze and what does our deen have to say about the gaze,
Mm.
I actually begin with the first, not defining. Most people will start with absar, of like the idea of what basar means. Basar is like eyesight, but actually a comprehensive word for eyesight. But what I want to start off with is in that statement, what does our deen say? What is deen, right?
Mm.
And deen really comes down to, all of us usually translate as like religion.
Mhm.
And then there'll be that one person always like, Islam is more than a religion, it's a way of life. And as much as I agree with that statement, that was originally what religion also meant, right? If we take it back to its Latin roots, like what is real and what is the basis of what is real. And that's actually what deen will be. Deen is typically translated actually as recompense, or uh, the basis behind a transaction. So in poetry, how deen was typically used was, or dayin, the root word of deen, was when you walked into a store and you handed someone money. The what caused you to do that was actually your deen. And what that means is what caused you to behave in the way you did was the presumption that maybe you're going to get a product, maybe you're going to get a service as a return. That is actually what deen is. And we talk about deen as a religion as a whole. What we're really talking about is the operating clause of the human being. What is the operating system? So when we say, what does our deen say about a certain topic? That's what we're really referring to, is what's the operating clause? And one of the operating clauses that our deen has is actually that anything that we are prescribed is something that takes us to Allah's. And I love what you said about these people who are on fitrah, these people that when they had nothing else distracting, they were just happy. They would smile at each other all the time. And subhanAllah, that's really interesting to think about. Of you actually have to learn to not smile at each other. And I can tell you this: I have a 3-month-old baby upstairs right now. And one of the things I can tell you is takes up majority of his day is getting our attention so that he can smile at us.
Absolutely.
And like literally, he'll make sounds all over that if you look at him, he'll just go. It's amongst the cutest things that children just do innately when they meet a stranger. When their eyes lock, what do? They smile. And because there's a degree of fitra that's to be associated there, as soon as the gaze glances on something, there's an appreciation of it. There's a confirming of the humanity of whatever your gaze has just met. So I think that's beautiful. But when we think about the prescriptions of our deen, they tend to do two things. They tend to preserve our fitra, or propagate / return us to our fitra. That's any command of our tradition just does that. That the natural state, the assumption is the natural state of the human being is good, is balanced. And anytime there's a prescription, it returns us back to a more perfect balance. And the easy ways we can talk about that would be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put many needs that we have for our human bodies, for our emotional needs. And when we fulfill those needs, we feel good. And those are oftentimes appetites that cause us to fulfill those needs. But when that appetite goes beyond a certain balance, it actually starts destroying us. And in order to prevent that destruction, that's when the prescriptions of revelation are put down. Just like food,
Yeah.
you need food to survive. If you go too far extreme and either not meeting your needs, or if you go too far in extreme of meeting excess than your needs, you will end up in a moment of hurt or pain. And which one is the greater evil? Depends on who you are. What's your tolerance? Depends on who you are. But there seems to be this balance in the physical example. The same thing could be said in anything that our deen prescribes. And I think that's a good introduction. My apologies, I'm getting over a cold of some sort here. But I think that's a good introduction of, even when we think about, well, what does Allah want us to see and what does Allah not want us to see? The gaze is just like any other part of the human being, just like an appetite, that it has an amazing use and some really good things can come out of it. But it can be, I'm not going to use the term weaponized just yet, because I think weaponization of the gaze is something we really need to talk about towards in a few minutes, inshallah. Once we talk about things that quite literally want to use your human tendencies in order to sell a product. We're going to get there in a second. But even without the malicious intent, if you allow an appetite to go unchecked, it can lead to destruction. But that doesn't mean the appetite itself was problematic.
Yeah.
Because the appetite was supposed to lead you to something good. And part of that is
necessary sometimes, yes.
Yeah, part of that is the gaze was meant to be something. And yes, we can talk about, there's different styles of looking at things, right? There's, when you look at someone and you appreciate them, when you look at someone and you want to figure out what's wrong so you can help them, those are very different styles of looking at things. When you look at someone and you feelings of intimacy, it's a different style of looking, but still all of them have their place of actually bringing about good. It's when they're unchecked, that's when the problem comes in. And I think with that, I wanted to ask you actually, Chaplain Patty, when you hear the term that's oftentimes described for the gaze, like ghadar basar, right? Of like lower the gaze. That's found in Surah An-Nur. What's your reaction to that command? First, in the most simplistic level, but what I really want to hear is, what do people get wrong about it?
What do people get wrong about it? You know, I feel like one of the things that I sort of intuitively feel is that one of the things that we get wrong is that somehow you're bad or shameful because you want to look in the first place. Does that make sense? To say that, you know, to lower the gaze, you know, can also be an act of compassion, right? It doesn't have to be like, you know, an act of disgust. Does that make sense? Like sometimes, you know, I feel like there's such like shame and stigma that you're like, oh, this is something bad, right? And so it's like you're almost getting conditioned to have an aversion in some sense, right? Instead of you know, lowering the gaze of an actual preservation, right? And that's kind of consideration. And I think that you know, part of it is also in the heart, right? Because it's an orientation of the heart as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree that, and I oftentimes like bringing up, this is not a very popular, not that it's not a popular opinion, but it's a detail that's not often shared in one of our classical stories growing up, which is the story of Maryam alayhi salam.
Yeah.
And in the story of Maryam alayhi salam, there's an interesting moment in which Maryam alayhi salam is secluded by herself, and an angel in the form of a man is walking by. And scholars, when they typically talked about it, they actually said she said what she said because there was a sense of attraction there.
And I think we've talked about this before, and I think that's one of the things that I love about the story of Maryam alayhi salam in the Muslim tradition, and the stories of our prophets in general, right? Is you know, I was actually raised Catholic, and you know, there's this tendency to you know, talk about Mary as someone as if the desires just did not exist, right? That these are people who don't have hormones or they don't have these inclinations, right? But the reality is the reason that they are models for us is because they have all the same biological things that everyone else does. They have those same, kind of natural inclinations, and they're models for us because they have that, because they feel all the pain that we feel, they struggle with all the things that we struggle with. They have the exact same biology that we have. Now, what do they do with it?
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what we need to model, instead of pretending like, these aspects of the self, of being human don't exist.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and I think from here I'm gonna move on to like I did want to address the weaponization of the gaze, right? Where I think everyone can agree on that there's
Mhm.
definite benefit when you appreciate, like, your sight has so much power. We can probably quote study after study about how majority of people are visual learners, right?
Yeah.
Where a visual component is almost necessary for being consumed by the masses. So like we 90% of communication is nonverbal communication. Where does that come from? That is from the pauses, that's from the cadence, but a lot of that is actually from when you're looking at someone. It's said in our tradition and in other traditions that the eyes are the window to the soul, right? There's so many kind of narrations about that, and to the point when your eyes meet someone, we can talk about it at a neurological level, like oxytocin is released just when you make eye contact with someone. Why? Because there's this moment of connection. That there was a definite role to the gaze.
Mhm.
And the benefits we're supposed to get from it is actually you should be um, looking at the people you're supposed to be looking at and really appreciating them. And this is something I think we don't appreciate as much. The sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, specifically when it was about his family,
Mhm.
is Aisha radiallahu anha narrated that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would speak to her, he
Mhm.
would look at her and he would look at her face intently.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think there's something beautiful there. He would do this to everyone in terms of like when he would look at them, he would look at them and he would turn his whole body towards them. But there
Mhm.
was this idea that his gaze made people feel empowered in that moment. And
Mhm.
the reason I start with this is I have to ask us the question of when we look at our parents, when we look at our siblings, when we look at our friends, does our gaze express a humanizing quality to it? Because we're going to get into certain pitfalls people fall into, that when you consume certain types of media, one of the things that actually starts changing is the way you look starts to change significantly. That there's this idea of you look at people when they are not looking at you. And that actually significantly changes the way you interact with people, even outside of that scenario. We'll get there, but the positive benefits of your gaze is supposed to humanize the person who's in front of you. And one of the things I think people get wrong about like lower your gaze is and the term that used here is basar, right? Basar doesn't just mean just to look at something is ara, tara.
Mhm.
It's with your eyes. Basar is with intent. When you look
Mhm.
at something with intent, and it says lower that. Lowering your gaze does not physically just mean this all the time. Yes,
Yeah.
it can mean that. But this is like sometimes you have to lower your gaze by not lowering your gaze is an actual thing. Like if you're talking to someone, stare at their face. That's a way to oftentimes lower your gaze and to follow the actual command that's to be found there. So I think that's one element of like it doesn't always just translate to this. Oftentimes, lowering your gaze means no, stare in a way in which your desires aren't like you lower your gaze by actually lowering your desires. So when you stare with purpose and stare in a way that the halal purpose is the one that's going to be expressed.
Mhm.
And I know this gets into
And I think like looking versus staring, right?
yeah.
As well. But yeah.
And I think this is where the question of eye contact comes in pretty frequently of
Yeah.
like men and women when they talk to each other, should they be making eye contact?
Mhm.
I think this is going to be a question that comes up in the Q&A. I personally don't have a direct answer for that question because I think it's very culturally subjective. That eye contact many times is extremely intimidating. And to lock it down in someone's eye the entire time might be something that they're not necessarily comfortable with, so it's not the best idea. And in different cultures it means different things. But can someone lower their gaze while making eye contact? I personally think yes, they can. Specifically, I find myself in a teaching environment where I'm interacting with men and women in front of me. And if I'm going to teach appropriately, I have to track with typically the eyes of my students to understand whether they are or are not getting it. And in that case, I think lowering the gaze actually really translates to look with the intent that you, like with the appropriate intent, which is what? Are they getting it? Are they not getting it? That's the reason to look. And there's a lot of benefit that comes from that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the word you just used there, tracking. Because, you know, as you were talking about like what makes people comfortable or uncomfortable, right? There's something when we talk about communication, this idea of mirroring, right? So if you can kind of notice what's going on with a person and, you know, mirror that to some degree, and if you're not comfortable with where they're at, then move it from there, right? And creating that kind of reciprocity in that sense.
Yeah. And here I'm now going to move over to the harm that comes from not using your gaze appropriately. Yeah. And one is, of course, the obvious ones is the creepiness factor, right? Like everyone's been in that moment where someone's staring at you intently and like they didn't have to do anything and you're just like creeped out by it. This happens more often to women than it happens to men, but it can happen to both. And everyone's kind of experienced that, but that's almost like the humorous dark side, even though I know that sometimes that can freak you out and cause literal anxiety. So I shouldn't talk about it in that level, but I do mean that it's more topical. What I'm getting into now is when the gaze gets weaponized. And what I mean by that is there are certain tendencies that we want to look at certain things. And Allah has created us in a way in which we appreciate good architecture. What I mean by that is that like when you see a well-built, well, maybe it's just me, but when you see like a well-built building, you're like, that looks cool. And I'm going to go as far as to say that's a protective factor of the human being to appreciate aesthetic beauty. When you see nature and it's like a beautiful day, you just said like that brings you happiness. There are those that are going to use that very real and awesome human tendency for a much darker purpose. I'm going to start off with the less dark purpose. And that less dark purpose is typically, I'm going to sell you a product, right? They're going to look at things that catch your eye so that you can waste your money. And it's not always wasting your money. Advertising has a whole like thing, like there's a reason we chose this on the Silru logo, right? Because we wanted, like, you look at it, I could go on a whole tangent here about Islamic geometry and how it points you towards nature. But there's this idea of when we look at something and it connects us to it, we're more likely to engage with it. That's good. Sometimes it's used to sell things. But the part that gets weaponized most often is actually using our gaze of attraction in order to kind of trap us. And in order to kind of really build this up, us being attracted to the opposite gender is supposed to be a reality that Allah created within us. That reality is supposed to be because human beings in our tradition, in our fitrah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed that human beings, among the best ways that a human being can exist, is for them to exist in the form of a family. And what is going to cause for a family to be the societal situation will be when men and women in controlled systems are attracted to each other. And the gaze has a very powerful part of like the attraction has a very powerful purpose. That what it's supposed to lead to is supposed to lead to this propagation. Remember we said every prescription in Islam is either a preservation or a propagation of the fitrah, of the natural state of the human being. If family is the best mechanism for a human being to develop. And what is the use of being attracted to the opposite gender will be what? So that you can bring about goodness in each other, companionship, because of course there's this idea of you provide each other emotional support, you make up for each other's weaknesses. There's so many benefits that come from the idea of people being paired, but also so that you create an environment in which information, goodness, morals, care get passed on to the next generation as well. Yeah. That's supposed to be the purpose of attraction between people. But when it's used to, on the lower level, sell products, when it's used on a slightly different level to actually circumvent maybe some of those more fitra realities, that's when we talk about weaponizing the gaze. And the effect that that can have is really, really significant. And the biggest, but the most significant effect that it actually has is that it actually prevents you from, in first and foremost, like engaging in that. It destroys families. Like with the purpose of it, that gets destroyed. And on the other front, even those secondary aspects of what the gaze gives you, of like appreciation when you look at someone. When you look at someone, you humanize them. When you become so used to just looking with a gaze of lust, that's the only gaze that you find valuable. So you stop appreciating when you look at nature outside and it's supposed to give you something in your heart, it doesn't anymore. When you're supposed to look at, and beauty isn't just supposed to be lustful beauty. When you look at someone who is beautiful, just for the sake of, like, when you see like someone who's even someone with your own within your own gender who's beautiful, you're supposed to be able to recognize it. When you see someone who's beautiful, who's elderly, who you respect and dignify, and you see them as beauty, you're supposed to appreciate that person's beautiful. When you see a young person without any lust, I'm talking like young people, and you appreciate like a cute child, that's a cute child and it should bring you happiness. But if we exercise our muscles of lust so much, that stuff starts disappearing. There's a very interesting interview by, it's the guy who was just given 300 years in prison. I forgot the guy's name, but he was some major player within the adult film industry, and he actually said something which was gross. And he said that when he now sees the lips of a child, the only thing he can think of is a sexual act. And that just makes you pause and makes you like, that is the effect that this can have. These natural good uses get completely stripped away.
You know, as you're talking and you're, you know, you've already talked about the impact of, you know, breaking down the family, the fact that we're giving these strong desires, inclinations constrained within the family, and then that family unit, you know, creating, you know, someone's going to be there when you need someone to be there, right? Like even when you're older, you have family that are going to care for you. If you have a sick or if you're whatever, you've got people that are going to take care of you, and the children that you have will have a family that take care of you, and all that bond is created. You know, it starts with the look. It starts with, you know, they say the twinkle in the eye, you know, but you know, then that kind of that connection that happens. So what happens when that twinkle, right, gets basically robbed, right? And you know, we're told that one of, like, that Satan loves nothing more than to become between a man and his wife, right? And you know, so when we're talking about this is what we really should think about. This is your enemy, Satan, you know, with some serious technology behind him now, right? You know, really trying to divide that, and in the same time working with people who are trying to, you know, just exploit, right? You know, we talk about magic now, right, as something like, as if it's something fictional, and if it's something from, you know, fairy tales or something like that, right? But we're people who actually believe in magic, right? We believe that there is something called sihr, and you know, if we look at the definitions of it, right, it really has to do with an illusion that is then, you know, causing people to act against their interest.
Oh,
um you know, and so when we're thinking of, you know, these kinds of things that are happening in the marketing industry, where they're exploiting psychology, when they're sitting here and knowing how dopamine triggers work, and how they can keep you just clicking on a screen until exhaustion, right? Then, you know, that is a kind of sihr. That's a kind of magic that people are getting, you know, kind of sucked into. And I think we have to have a lot of compassion with people, and we have to beware, right? Because you know, there's no, like, there's nothing wrong with the fitra, as we mentioned. Like, people aren't bad because they have these desires. They're not bad because they have hormones, dopamine, or, you know, want to have oxytocin, right? We all want to love and be loved, right? This is fitra, right? But you now have an enemy who has this, like, you know, kind of triggering thing that's happening. And, part of what you're talking about in there is then, well, what is happening with this, right? Is that they're changing the fitra in the sense of, we all know Pavlov's dogs, right? So Pavlov now can, the dogs would salivate at a ringing of a bell. Well, the ringing of a bell has nothing to do with what tastes good and what naturally would cause a dog to salivate, right? But what's happening with this is creations and introductions of unnatural triggers, right?
I
So,
actually want to share an example that really,
mhm,
in my opinion, explains that really well. To the bio majors, I apologize, and I'm going to do some recap to what you probably learned in your first year. And if there's 70 people here, there's probably, I don't know, 30 bio majors. Sorry, not that I want to stereotype. But the Tinderbergen experiment actually signifies this pretty beautifully in how a trigger can be weaponized. And I think it's useful to kind of hear this, where this was a weird experiment that was done in, I believe, the late 70s, where they found that these seagulls had chicks that would hide themselves and were very well camouflaged in these rocks. And seagulls, the adult seagulls actually don't have very good eyesight. So the adult seagull would come and these chicks would almost appear out of nowhere from the rocks because of how well camouflaged they were. And they're like, what makes these little chicks recognize their parents? Because they're completely well hidden. And what they started doing is experiments. They took a bunch of chicks and put them in rocks that were very similar to their natural environment. And then they would come out with like a dummy seagull. Like they'd make a sock puppet or something out of a seagull. And they'd come out and they'd like try to get it to come out. And they'd record the rate at which their made figure made it into or promoted this response for these chicks to come out and open their mouth to get food. And
mhm,
as they were doing it, at first they had like the actual seagull, and it had around a 91% success rate. That when the mother would come in, the seagull chick would come out. Then they made a puppet which had like a 50%. Then they made a bunch of models until they actually used a yellow pencil with a dot. I wish it was yellow, it is not. But they had a yellow pencil with a red dot, and they would wave that in the eyesight of the baby seagull.
mhm.
They got a response rate of 96%. And the
Huh,
reason that's so significant is the actual mother
mhm,
had a response rate of 91%.
mm,
So they figured out how to get the response,
mm,
even though it has nothing to do with the seagull being fed in that moment. They have uh, figured out the actual trigger. And I argue that what's being done when people are addicted and industries like pornography is they figure out millions of dollars of research and generations of tests have gotten people to the point where they know how to keep you satisfied, but not totally satisfied, just satisfied so that you're going to come back.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the thing about dopamine, right? Dopamine is desire, not satisfaction,
Mhm.
right? So you keep going because you think that you're almost there,
Yeah.
but you're not. You're just exhausting yourself, actually.
Yeah. And they have no intention of actually fulfilling you, because if you did, they're not going to watch anything else.
Mm,
But every angle that's used, every sound that's put forward, it is manufactured in a way to
yeah.
keep you coming back, because they have figured out, and they've actually figured out how to do it better than actual. And I'm I'm not shy to be explicit here because I think it's for the sake of learning.
Mhm,
Actual intercourse between spouses is meant to be fulfilling in a holistic way. What
mhm,
the intercourse is presented as in pornography does not aim to represent that. What
yeah.
it aims to represent is the desire aspect, almost to a weaponized level.
Mhm,
And then there's actually not supposed to be a full-on payoff, because if there was, you wouldn't come back.
mm, yeah.
And that's really an issue. And I think here we can add in the added habit that oftentimes is related with not being able to lower the gaze, is also engaging in the act of masturbation.
Mhm,
And when this occurs in sync with consuming, whether it's pictures, videos that are designed to bring up your lust, um, the act itself is problematic, but what the act actually does, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again put sexual desire within us, and it is amongst the strongest things that a human being can feel, but it is so that you have among the strongest purposes of a human being, which is what? Bring about goodness and satisfaction between a couple, and to produce the most accomplished a human being can ever feel is, at least in my short life, has been like being a father is like bar none. Like nothing I have ever done has as much accomplishment as when you have the ability of like seeing your child smile or like your family being happy.
Yeah.
That was actually supposed to be what the act of procreation was linked to. But what masturbation does is actually completely makes it useless to a point where it's for self-pleasure. Like your mind is releasing two major hormones, and you've already brought these two up: oxytocin and dopamine. Oxytocin is considered the connection hormone. A typical human being, a typical male, the highest oxytocin they will ever experience will be in the act of sexual like release, right? A typical human female that will actually have a higher source of oxytocin, and that's when she's giving birth. When they're giving birth, and this makes a lot of sense when you think
breastfeeding too, right? Isn't it breastfeeding also to oxytocin?
But not nearly as high as when they're giving birth. And this makes a lot of sense. Everyone can track here, even if you're not very sciencey. When a mother is giving birth to her child, it is not pleasant. It is very painful. But as soon as the child comes out, does the mother say, "Get that thing away from me"? That would be the response, right? My wife just went through over a 30-hour labor. I can tell you that she was in pain. But you know what her first response was as soon as the baby was out? "Let me see him. Let me hold him." Like she immediately wanted to hold him. And she sounded way better than I did. But why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused her mind to flood with oxytocin, connection hormone. And Allah causes our minds to flood with oxytocin also when we have a sexual experience or a release, right? When we climax. And the reason that was supposed to happen was so you can connect with someone. The person who you just had this amazing experience with, you're supposed to connect with them. That's lost with pornography and masturbation. The other thing that's lost is the other major thing. I said two major neurotransmitters are released. There's actually 7, but I'm just going to focus on 2 of them to not bore everyone. Will be dopamine. Dopamine is considered the like either chasing happiness or accomplishment, or like chasing accomplishment hormone, as it's typically found. And
that works for the gaming addictions too.
Definitely. And dopamine is supposed to be released again in a moment of like extreme accomplishment, or like the perception of accomplishment. The highest dopamine rushes you can find of people, you know, like a boxer, as soon as they win their match, or like a basketball player, as soon as they become declared the MVP, they say really dumb stuff. Like, "I'm on top of the world, you can do anything," like all of that type of like what's happening. That's a huge dopamine rush. Right. It's a moment of accomplishment. It makes sense that after the act of intimacy, after intercourse, you're supposed to feel accomplished. Why? Your partner and you are supposed to feel super happy with each other, for each other, because this is one of the forms of communication that you will keep your family together. It's really powerful. But when you do that and there is no one, when you do that and there is nothing to show for it, you're actually burning out your own Allah's created mechanisms for you to feel connection and to feel accomplishment. And the analogy I like using for this is, if someone tells you that they have 500 best friends, does that word mean anything to them? No. It's like, no, every person they meet on the street is their best friend at that point, right? And it's like, or if I told you that you get a trophy every time you take a breath, like, dude, a trophy is meaningless. That's kind of what starts happening when this is done and there's nothing to show for it. There's no one to get close to. There is no actual feeling of accomplishment. That mechanism of connection and that mechanism of accomplishment actually starts decreasing. That's the real big harm. And on a personal level, it makes you lose motivation. It makes you lose the ability of connecting with people in a real way.
Yeah, yeah.
Super problematic.
Even in day-to-day interactions, not necessarily relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even talking about marriage yet, right? I'm just talking about literally your friends, you feel like you can connect with them less. When
Yeah.
you want to study for a class, motivation is just down because that's also controlled by a dopamine trigger.
Mm.
These are affected, not even getting into the social elements of what this can do to marriages,
Yeah.
where this was supposed to be something that was looked forward to. This was supposed to be something that created actual beauty and unity and cooperation between the two of you. And no, the intent and the behavior becomes no self-fulfillment. The behavior becomes, what can I get out of it? The behavior becomes looking for that next rush.
Mm, mm, mm. And I think that you really like talk so much about, okay, what's happened in the culture. And, when we talk about, imagery, right, this produced imagery, and then getting into the internet, we're talking about sexual revolution, like what has changed in just 100 years in human society, right? You talk about like this idea of sweetness, like people, like even when I was younger, I think people talked more about making love when I was a child than you hear about that now, like, right, there's a much more kind of utilitarian having, kind of thing versus this idea of love. And when we talk about, again, this weaponization and those two-dimensional images, right, that those are produced for visual and impact, which is different than the physical experience. When it was in magazines, at least the real thing was more, was people still knew that was better, right? But when you start getting like 200 images a minute, like that's just a whole nother kind of ball of wax. But what happens in this and is that things are created to be visually appealing, right, that are not part of the fitra,
Mm.
right? So when like, so we talked about the book of Ibn um Qayyim al-Jawzi. um when he talks about these things, and you mentioned on this, so when he talks about the things that are considered haram sexual things between husband and wife, right, and he talks about the side effects of them, right? So one of the things I'm going to say is that a lot of things we considered normal didn't even come up with these books, which means they are so far from the fitra, right? Because there wasn't shyness. There was talking about different things, right? That what is being produced by this industry is so far from the fitra, it wasn't even brought up in the books, in previous centuries. Um, but to sit there and say that, like, okay, what is the impact of having these relations? And I've known a lot of people who in the marriages, I've had friends who've told me I've never been able to enjoy my relationships, right? Because my spouse wants to do what he's seen on these films or what he's seen in these movies, and I've never enjoyed it.
Mm.
And I don't like it. And so one of the things that has happened is that people think that porn is a source of sex education, right? And so they want to learn to be good or learn how to do it or learn about it, and because there's not forums and they don't know where to go to talk about it and learn about it in a halal way, right, and what is actually healthy intimacy, they go to these sources, right, and then they become like those chickens you mentioned who are like going to a pencil instead of their mother, right? But then they're taking that into their next relationship, right? And so what he says in this about is that it creates stress, it creates anxiety, and it creates distension in the relationship, right? It creates animosity, and it creates and instead of, like you said, like the natural healthy sexual relationship should be something that bonds, right? It should be something that we say it's intimacy, so it creates that closeness, it cements that closeness, and then you're a strong pair, right? We said to do the parenting and all the other things that you can do as a pair, right? um
That's a great
but
soundbite, by the way. That it takes you pair. That's why it's called parenting. Sorry, just got to mention that.
yeah, yeah. But instead you don't have that, right? Instead, that which is supposed to bind you is becoming something that is keeping you really separate, and that's a real tragedy, right? And that's why, I mean, I really think that when we think about like the challenges of this generation, right, we have to recognize it. That's why we have to have this conversation as well.
Definitely. And here
um,
I do want to move towards solutions, because I think, of course, I think we've beaten it down that this has many negative consequences at an individual, at a societal, at a family level. But solutions, if someone has fallen into this trap, there isn't hopelessness. And what I mean by that is, yes, this is problematic. You can read a bunch of studies if you want. A great website, and it sounds like a weird website, but just bear with me, is yourbrainonporn.com.
Mm-hmm.
It literally puts out brain scans of people who have been addicted and are not addicted, and like what their brains look like is different. Even to the point, some things are like really scare you, that when they the same part of your brain gets activated when you look at a woman. It was mainly done on men. Was the same part of the brain that gets activated is the same part that gets activated when they look at a piece of flesh, like literal raw meat, when they're hungry. And that's disgusting. And that is not the same part that gets activated for someone who is not addicted to pornography. What the part of their brain that gets activated is actually the part of the brain that says human being. Like there's a massive disconnect, which is weird. I have to just throw this in there before getting into some of the solutions of how to get out. I think it's also a weird misnomer, and this should just be mentioned, that this is an unpopular opinion to have, to say that, hey, we as a community, we're against pornography. We're against, like, that is not a popular place. And also, studies don't promote this. There are certain areas within psychological sciences and biological sciences that people do not want to study, and this happens to be one of them. And one place this is really clear is, I remember when the major the initiation of the Me Too movement was really taking hold in 2018. I was actually going to be ghostwriting an article with someone, which was the link between pornography and the Me Too movement that no one is talking about. And what I mean by that is, the most consumed media in our country is pornography. And what does it promote? The objectification, terrible power dynamics between typically men and women. And if it's this consumed, we think that has no impact on how people are going to behave when they think no one is watching them. When they do when they consume this stuff when no one is watching them, we don't think that has anything to do with it. And it was just weird that you don't see articles or links of that coming out, because there are certain dead spots within even research institutions. So that's one part I wanted to just make sure that we
and there's a couple other things too, because when we think of, again, how do humans learn? Like, when a baby learns, right, learns its facial expression, children they learn by watching behavior, right? So on a subconscious level, when we are exposed to behavior, it becomes normalized, which makes your willingness to do that on a subconscious level more likely, right? So the other thing that they talk about in terms of the escalation is that there's a novelty aspect to it, right? And so it becomes more outrageous, more away from the fitra, and more violent, with consumption.
Which I have to just interject here. I've heard the argument, doesn't that happen in normative, like, marriage relations too? And the answer to that is no. And the main reason is because there's a relationship that is the basis of it. That what you want grown is not the sexual experience. What you want grown is the relationship.
Right.
So we just wanted to quickly toss that in there, that doesn't actually happen in responsible sexual engagement.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I mean, that's a big difference. And I feel like I don't want us to not mention the other side of it, that this demand is also driving something like human trafficking. Definitely. And real abuse of real human beings, women and children, right? And so that the participation of that is also driving that demand.
This was from the World Health Organization in 2014. There are more slaves alive today than have ever been in human history. And they said actually a majority of it are sex slaves, because the demand for pornography is that high. And that every click, and in that same study, that every click does have a monetary value. Because I've heard the argument before that, like, oh no, well, only free things. No, those they're being paid for somehow, and your click actually does have a value associated with it. So wanted to throw in there, but I
I'm
wanted.
gonna make a nudge because we've had Zoom bombing happen this year too, right? And you know, and I hate to say it, but when we talk about evil, like, you know, here you have people who maybe weren't going into that, they're now being exposed to a shocking image, which is now, you know, making people, you know, curious to say like, wait, I never saw anything like that before, and then your curiosity goes, and then suddenly you're clicking through a whole bunch of shocking images. Um,
uh,
so yeah, it's very like malicious in that sense.
Yeah, and without getting conspiracy theory-ish, like I think there's a giant agenda of
Yeah.
taking people away from their natural fitra state, which
Hmm.
I think this is a conversation for another taboo topic that we'll eventually have. But the idea of is liberalism or a blind following of liberalism good for our community? And I think that's a conversation for another point. But this is an area in which you can see a massive disconnect that typically secularism promotes. Do whatever you want, do what feels good, and
Hmm.
where our tradition says no, step back, that is a dangerous door. And but now I want to get right back into some of the solutions that are there are not as complicated as people think. And I know so many people have been in this boat where they've tried to quit for years and they
Hmm.
and I want to just lay out a couple of principles, and Chaplain Patty and faces as well. One of the reasons I actually wanted to do the taboo topics on this is, especially as people are spending a lot more time at home, this problem is becoming very prevalent. And over the last couple of months, I've had dozens of men and women who have said, this is something I'm addicted to, and I finally want to kick the habit. And some principles just to lay out is recognize that, recognize the mechanism of how it works so
Hmm.
that you can reverse it. What it's doing is it's taking away your motivation and taking away your ability to connect with people. You can actually start introducing those things in order to make you less addicted. So some like principles I usually like putting out there is recognize it's going to be a gradual process.
Hmm. Yeah.
Almost everyone has a narrative with how they got addicted to this. It didn't just happen one day and then suddenly they started doing this daily. That doesn't happen. It's generally you were exposed and then you were curious and then weeks passed, months passed, and then the habit as it exists today is actually a result of a massive narrative. The best thing to do is recognize your narrative. Um,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to sound a bit harsh and difficult to do. It's probably the hardest step. And almost anyone who has ever recovered, they say this was the step that would change the game for them. Was you actually have to tell someone your narrative. And I know that's terrible because you're thinking like, no, I would never tell someone this. And yes, we have a concept of don't expose your sins, but we're talking about getting off of an actual addiction in this case, and accountability is huge. So speak your narrative to someone. If you think you're strong enough to do it yourself, write your narrative down in a place that no one can read it.
Hmm.
Understand it because not everyone gets into it for the same reason. Some people are bored,
Yeah.
so they fit this in. Some people they aren't connecting with people, so they fit this in. Like, what is your narrative? What need of yours is this action addressing? Start
Mm-hmm.
addressing the need. So if it's I don't have any social interaction, you start introducing that as you start reducing this. And there's even other interventions, and all of these things are going to help by like certain percentage points.
Hmm.
Things could even be like, start thinking about maybe some things in your diet that are really pushing this forward. Um, uh, Without getting too cliche, you are what you eat type thing. There's a reason that there's a like almost a unwritten rule in our society that like on prom night they're supposed to have steak. Why? Because beef has a high degree of creatine in it, which when creatine is consumed causes men to express testosterone. That causes their libido to go up. Consuming a lot of meat is actually very much linked to higher
And
libido.
I'm like, and weddings too.
Yeah.
Like the whole culture of like steak
So
and anniversaries. No, I'm just kidding.
that's going to help you. It won't help you like 50%, but that's going to help you like 3%. Change,
Yeah.
change that about yourself. Look at, do I appreciate other beautiful things? And what I mean by that is not lustful things. Like, do I actually appreciate actual beauty? Like,
Mm,
am I amazed by aesthetic beauty?
mm,
And if the answer to that is no, start reintroducing that into your life. Because oftentimes what's happening is you're using pornography to treat certain deficiencies within your life.
yeah.
Start treating those with the actual productive things, and you're going to find you don't need that sin anymore. And that's really the way to get rid of a sin, is you don't need it anymore because you found a halal alternative for it.
I think there's something in what you're saying too, is also, you know, knowing that resensitization takes a time period, right? So if you've been giving yourself like such intense stimulus, and then you know, remove that, you know, there's going to be, you know, they call like flatline, right? So you give it time before you become, you know, sensitive again. I got muted.
My apologies. I was trying to let someone in.
Am I being censored now? Can't be censored in taboo topics, no. But yeah, so to realize that like there may be a time where you feel like you just don't feel very much, right? But to know that it's a time period and it's not a permanent state, and that, you know, when you get to the other side of it, you'll get sweetness again.
Yeah.
Right?
And to reward little successes. So when when people have come to me with this program, I typically put them on a 6-year to 2-year program. I mean, a 6-month to 2-year program. Sorry, 6-year would be pretty crazy. But a 6-month to 2-year. The shortest I've ever seen this healthily removed is 6 months, because there's de-escalation of content, there's a decrease of frequency, and then there's also, this is the part that I emphasize the most, you need to start appreciating once it stops taking a hold on you, and you appreciate and celebrate the little tiny accomplishments. And what I mean by that is literally some of the questions we ask is, when you look at, and this, if it is men, it'll be when you look at women, and if this is a woman, when you look at men, where do your eyes wander towards? Have you noticed that starting to change? Like when you start finding that, it feels so good. People literally are like, I got my life back. Why? Because now when I talk to someone, like my self-esteem is so high because I'm not feeling guilty for what I just did or something like that. That stops happening. And some phrases I like saying is, you first start caging the problem so that the problem doesn't control you. And these are some other strange parts of this, and maybe we'll talk more about this in the Q&A session, which should be starting very soon, inshallah. Is that I get asked the question of like, well, if you put me on a program, the program typically has me watching pornography and actually engaging in masturbation, and it's a planned thing. Why am I planning a sin? I'm like, I get it. You're not supposed to ever plan sins. But in this case, we're talking about getting someone off of an addiction. Controlling it is amongst the best tools that you have so that it doesn't control you. We limit the damage that it's going to do until it gets to the point where it's manageable. So you typically go on a program. These are just some principles of that program. But what I really wanted to emphasize is the amount of change that it can introduce into someone's life is, like, subhanAllah, amazing. Their interaction, they feel like they can tolerate the people in their life more. Why? Because again, it was almost like getting someone off of drugs. Like they used to get all of their fulfillment from a substance, and now what are they getting their fulfillment from, or feelings of accomplishment from? When they talk to people, when they work out, when they wake up and appreciate like a sunrise, when they, like, all of these things together make a much more holistic happiness and fulfillment than these fake images, this like unfulfilling deed. The other things would be a much more fulfilled, resilient and fulfilled kind of existence. So it changes so much. And actually thinking about this in a very positive way, so much of, unfortunately, our society is controlled by like, I'm gonna call it for what it is, but like weaponized lust, that in terms of how advertising works, in terms of how spaces are set up, in terms of, and not even getting into the direct parts of it. The direct parts are literally millions of people's lives are destroyed or are being humiliated because of this. But even on an average level of like what our kids are exposed to when they're walking somewhere, the clothing that people are subjected to wear, and I'm using that as the operating clause, subjected to wear, how much influence it has on the fashion industry, on the beauty industry, on beauty standards. Like, there's so much that could be said about this, but all of that can start changing if people's individual habits start changing. Literally, we can start undoing the damage that it's done for 2 generations.
Mm, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think is really with me is, like you mentioned a little bit this idea of the left that's sort of in denial about some things. And, so often I feel like as Muslims, we talk about, we're the people of the middle way, we're the people of the balance. And so we really aren't, often with the right or the left, right? But, what does it mean for us to be like that best ummah for humanity, right? And I think that's, is part of what we're really called to in this time, right? In terms of, for our own community, what does it mean to, you know try and talk about reinstilling the sunnah in this time, or calling to Allah and the messenger? Part of it is just calling to being a human being, you know and in a way that is beneficial for everyone, right? And I think that, for us to be able to have that conversation and to do it in a compassionate way, not a reactionary way, because that's part of the reason the conversations are hard, is because they've been reactionary, right? I think inshallah that could be, a great contribution, particularly, for this generation and for the society in whole.
Uh, And I think that's a great place to end. I have a very cheesy quote that our Deen calls us to be superhuman, not superhuman. Um, the idea of our Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam was superhuman in terms of the most human you could be.
Mm, mm,
That's
mm,
the word. Not superhuman in terms of the opposite of what a human is.
mm, 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 mm.
So
Yeah.
with that, we'll conclude at least our conversation part of today's session, inshallah. But you guys have been filling up the Q&A. I can see there's dozens of responses already on it.